Hey everyone, this is Jennifer with Midwest Wilderness Connections. I told everyone I would go back out to the railroad right-of-way where I found prairie remnants, and so that's what I'm doing today. I'll go through and show you what this particular prairie looks like. So first off, right off the bat, we have gray-headed coneflower. They have petals they've got heads with petals that kind of point down or backwards. You kind of think of it as badminton birdie. That's one way to help recognize the flower or remember it. And you can see they've got these highly dissected leaves. And they can change somewhat as you go down the stem. We also have right here this grass that is Canada wild rye. That's kind of an early successional grass. That's interesting. We have here, they're not blooming yet. This is one of the native sunflowers. If I touch it, top and bottom of the leaves, I touch the stem, it's incredibly rough. So this is going to be prairie sunflower. There's many different sunflowers, and they can be tricky to tell apart. And they also hybridize, which doesn't make it easy, which means the species will cross-pollinate and kind of make a hybrid between two species. So they can be kind of tough. Now, when I was out here this spring, you guys saw a lot of yellow flowers that I told you were really important pollinator plants for those early spring pollinators that were coming out. The leaves I just showed you there, that's the golden Alexander leaf. They're the yellow flowers on my previous video of the site. As you can see here, just over the little hilltop we have here is a really good stand of the Canada wild rye. It's got that drooping head. Now this plant here with the white flowers, that's white sweet clover. It's an invasive species, can cause a lot of problems in prairies. It's a biennial, which means the first year it grows and it's just vegetative, and then the second year it blooms. And so if you're trying to get rid of this plant, you've got to constantly get rid of those seed heads and try to exhaust the seed bank to get rid of this species. But that's an invasive plant you're going to see in a lot of prairies, and unfortunately a lot of people used to plant it, some probably still do, for wildlife, because it is a legume which has got a lot of protein that deer and some other wildlife eat it like candy. The problem is it's invading the prairies, and so always try to find a native plant that will meet your needs. There's usually one out there. You just got to look for it or ask. Here, down below, you can see these little plants that are coming up with real fine leaves. That's going to be heath aster. Not blooming yet, but it's going to be out soon. That's kind of a common early successional plant. Right here, we did talk about this in the last video. I'm going to talk about it again just a minute here, so those who didn't see the first video. This is red clover. It's another invasive exotic plant. It can invade prairies. Some people have a lot of trouble with it. I haven't had a lot of trouble with it. If you've got a pretty good diverse plant stand, sometimes it can crowd it out. But that also depends on things like soil, management, history, all that good stuff. So it can be a tricky one. Down below here, we've got some seed heads. I don't know if you can see those there. They potentially were prairie phlox. We didn't get here in time to see those. We also have got a rubus, one of the raspberries. This plant here, or this seed here, head right here, this is from yarrow seed head. And what I'm going to do is I'll zip down so you can see those very fine ferny leaves. Usually those are pretty easy to pick out. So let's zip back a little bit further here. I'm seeing some really interesting plants. Now, I was on a roadside, and then there's a ditch. There's kind of a little hill, and on the other side of the hill I'm coming down now. I'm coming down on the side that's catching water, and so it's a little bit wetter. And so that's why we see here I have the swamp milkweed. Now, a lot of the research is indicating that this milkweed may be the most favored milkweed for the monarchs. So if you've got a wet spot, definitely consider this plant if you're trying to establish habitat for monarchs. This plant right here, that's a goldenrod. I'm going to assume right now that's Canada because it does have a little bit of fuzziness on the stem, and it's got the 3 parallel veins on the leaf. Those can be tricky, and they can hybridize as well. Some of those different goldenrods. Here we've got the heads of a bulrush. This is dark green bulrush, wetland plant. Behind it, you can see these really robust pointed leaves, large, long leaves. Those are the leaves of sawtooth sunflower, not blooming yet. We'll have to come back and check those out. I'll give you guys a little more of a close-up of these swamp milkweeds. Beautiful plant. But don't just grow them in a regular garden. Typically, they are going to need wetter soil. If you plant them somewhere where it doesn't have wetter soil, they're really susceptible to the milkweed aphids. I know, because I've dealt with it. So down here, see that little spherical head? That's a type of rush. It's Torrey's rush. It's a juncus species. Really interesting little plant. There are skipper butterflies. If you guys follow my social media accounts, a lot of times I have pictures or videos of these skipper butterflies. And they feed on a lot of the grasses or sedges or rushes, which typically don't get restored in prairie restorations, which means we're limiting the ability of our restorations to house a suite of species, a full suite of species. So if you're doing some restorations, figure out what kinds of the native grasses, the poaceae, the sedges, which are in the carex, the rushes that are the genus Juncus. Check them out and see if any of them would do well in a planting in the type of location where you are. This is Culver's root. Bumblebees really like it. It's a great plant, does well in backyard gardens if you're interested in planting it. What you can do, you look at the leaves down here and you can see the leaves are whorled. And so it's attractive for its flowers, but then also its vegetation, the vegetative part of it. The leaves are kind of interesting and add texture to your planting. That bird we're hearing right now, that is the dick sissel, and that is a species of greatest conservation need in most of the Midwest states. And we've got prairie habitat here. It's a grassland bird, and it's enjoying this little patch as much as I am, if not more so. Real quick, we're going to zip back. I've got one more plant here to show you before we keep moving on. This is compass plant. So you see the flowers coming off up there. And we come down, it's got this really stocky stalk for the flower, and then those highly dissected leaves that are at the base of the plant. Down here, we have an aster, not blooming yet. We'll have to come out later for this one. It's most likely, it looks like the smooth blue aster. And here are the seed heads of that golden Alexander that I mentioned earlier. You guys remember this one, the grass? Canada Wild Ray. Do you remember the yellow flowers that look like badminton birdies? Do you remember what those were? Yellow-headed coneflower. And I don't know if you guys saw when I just stepped, but a bunch of different butterflies, small, kind of nondescript butterflies, took off from the vegetation. These remnants are so important. A lot of people will look at these sites and think maybe it's just a bunch of weeds, but it really isn't. You really got to get in here and explore. They're really interesting. Here's another plant. Here it looks like a goldenrod. We're getting to the top, but there are a couple of different ones. There's late and there's tall. I'll look it up. Get home. I can't remember here in the field how to tell the difference between the two, other than looking at the leaves and then looking at the stem. Is it hairy? Are they smooth? Their colors. Everything on this is fairly smooth. It's got hairs top and bottom, that kind of stuff. So we'll check that out later. When I post the video, I'll have a caption for it. They're a little bit past prime here, but we do have wild bergamot. You've probably been seeing a lot of posts, especially with bees or butterflies on this right now. It's an extremely important nectaring plant for so many of the pollinators, the butterflies, the bees, etc. And there's research that's very interesting going on about pollinator use of plants, not just for their nectar. There are some plants, and it wouldn't surprise me with this bergamot, wild bergamot, or the bee balm, they find that this is true for it too, because a lot of the mints have these chemicals to them. That's why they have their aroma. If you take a little bit of the leaf and you roll it, you can get a real minty smell. And certain bees and butterflies will feed from certain plants, basically looking for medicine. I know that some pollinators do that with turtlehead plants. There's research or recent study coming out about monarch butterflies doing that. I've seen monarch butterflies doing it as well. They were only on the dead stems of what's called groomswell in an Iowa prairie. And I always wondered what was going on with them, and someone else has just submitted some information about that as well, where they were noticing these monarchs feeding off stems of plants and not using the nectar, but actually concentrating their activity on the stems and the leaves. And there are PAs, there are chemicals called PAs, and they may be helping the butterflies get rid of parasites, or they're treating themselves. In the case of some of the butterflies, they found that nobody knows how this is happening, but the male butterflies may be passing that chemical along to their young, which is really interesting, because the male, once the male and female, they mate, the male goes on his merry way, the female goes on her merry way. But somehow the PAs that male butterfly has collected is getting passed along to the larvae. And like I said, that can help rid them of parasites. It can also help with them being too toxic for other organisms to prey upon. So it also helps them from getting eaten. But here is another swamp milkweed. You can see there's a little bit of it out here. Very beautiful. Now, I'm going to show you something. You see the giant ragweed. That's the tall plants that are all along the river tract here. It's like this because, and you can see, if I go here, you can see it's kind of dead brown just beyond it. The railroad, they're coming through and they'll spray herbicides because they need to keep vegetation off of the rails. That's understandable. But what's happening is because they've killed the native vegetation, the weeds are creeping in. And so that's one of the complexities you have when you're trying to manage sites like this, especially when you're between a railroad on one side and a roadway on the other. Because I'm going to show you here, basically this prairie remnant's getting pinched. Because then you see the road, they are going to keep these road edges mown for safety reasons. And so it can be really complex working with these sites, trying to keep them from being overrun with weeds. Here's a neat plant. This is rosin weed. Pretty, some flower-like flowers on it. You come down here and you can see they've got leaves. They're opposite, directly opposite from each other. And when you feel them, they're rough and they're very stout. All right, they're that's why they're called rosin weed, or its Latin name is Silphium integrifolium, and it's because like integrity of the foliage, because it's so stout. That's a great prairie plant. And down here, I'm just going to show you the leaves again. This little patch isn't blooming, but this is the wild. Oh, it does. I got some spent flowers there. That's that wild bergamot. But when I was talking about that whole thing about the chemicals and what the different pollinators are using them for, I'm just saying that to get people to stop just thinking about sugar water, stop thinking about just floral resources, stop thinking about just milkweed. You have to have all the components. What good is a community without a hospital? That's how I think about these types of things. We have to restore all the components if we're going to be successful. Now up here, there's a lot of invasive grass here. There's a lot of brome grass. People struggle with that and some prairie restorations as well. It's almost always a given. You're going to have it in the railroad right-of-ways just because it's one of the most common plants planted along those railroads, and then also along the roads, the roadsides. I don't know if you guys can see all of these moths and skippers and butterflies. It's amazing how many are flushing as we walk past here. Like I said, this is why I want to show you guys these sites, because at first someone may think this is just looks like a weedy mess, but once you get in there, you find out it's actually quite different. Lots of swamp milkweed over the ridge there. Compass plant. It's a good compass plant. So what you notice is the most flowering plants, the greatest diversity. I get out of the road ditch, I go up on the top of the hill, and it's on the back slope of this little hill that's going towards the railroad track. These are the areas that were least disturbed. The railroad didn't spray far enough to kill them. The roadside crews haven't mown or sprayed enough to kill them. So when I first step into the prairie, it's a lot of weedy stuff because it's on that edge. But once you go in a little bit further and you get towards the interior, you're getting more plant species. It's getting more diverse. And so that's another lesson, is when you restore prairie, try to make the prairie as large as you can with the least amount of edge. Say here we've got maybe a 20-foot swath. All right, and So if it's just linear, which means there's a lot of edge. A lot of edge isn't necessarily good. But if this was more a block of habitat, if we came in here and restored prairie and made a square or even a circle, a huge circle, what happens is you reduce the amount of edge and you get more interior habitat. And that's usually where the magic happens. That's where you're going to get some of the really interesting plant and animal associations, the greatest species diversity, all that good stuff. So like I said, really great stand of swamp milkweed. And again, when I was talking about those plants, like the monarchs, they use the milkweed. That's the only larval food resource for their caterpillars. And every milkweed has a different amount of cardenolides. That's that chemical they're looking for to ward off predators. And what happens is the female monarchs somehow know that the parasite loads are higher, the density of monarch caterpillars is higher. There's something that's triggering her. If she's in those situations where she knows her young are a little more danger and they need a little oomph, she'll use one of the milkweeds that has the higher cardenolide content. And on years where it just doesn't seem to be as much of an issue, they'll use milkweed. Like the common milkweed's got a lower level of cardenolides. So this is, again, this is my soapbox. Don't just plant common milkweed. That's not good enough. If we're going to save these species, we have to plant the suite of milkweeds so that that mother monarch can come into these sites and pick out the one that's right for her and her babies at that particular point in time. Give them options. So that usually means very diverse mixes. There's no such thing as too much diversity. Get as much diversity in those mixes as you can, and you're going to have a better shot of actually really helping some of these species. Here's that that prairie sunflower again. They also call it rigid or stiff because it's got these really stiff, and if you felt this is like real coarse sandpaper. The stem too is rough. Oh, we actually have a golden Alexander that's should have been blooming a long time ago, and it's rearing its head here. So I'm glad you guys got to see that. That's what the flowers look like. And down here, I don't know if you guys can see those. There we go. That's a wild strawberry. That's a wild strawberry plant right there. Again, they bloomed way early in the season. You might see strawberries on them this time of year. You're not usually going to see flowers. And as you can see, there are a lot of shrubs, trees that are trying to invade this site. Some of them are native, like some of these dogwoods. Some of them aren't, and even a native plant can become a problem in the wrong place. So a lot of times these dogwoods come in because there's no fire any longer, and usually the fire would knock them back. So now we have to physically come in here and get rid of those invasive shrubs if we're going to save these prairies. Usually those shrubs, 9 times out of 10, are not in any danger of going extinct. They're very common. So us coming in and taking them out is not a problem for those species. Leaving them is a huge problem for the prairie. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to come up here. I'm going to move closer. You guys watch how many little skipper butterflies and things. I'm just hoping that this video is catching a number of them taking off from these sides, or taking off from the vegetation. Again, berries. Got native berries out here. Look like red raspberries. Do you guys remember the name of this one? Very tall, stout stem. Get down to the base, you get these highly dissected leaves. That's the compass plant. Remember this one? Not as tall, not as robust. Come down. You've got very rough leaves opposite. They almost attach without a petiole, which means they don't have like a stem to attach to the main stem. The cauline stem is what it's called. This is the rosinweed. We also have the seed heads of one of the native onions, or meadow garlic, one of the two. Yeah, when I was talking about the monarchs using plants, especially with the milkweeds that vary in the amount of cardenolides they have in them. I was on a prairie remnant in Illinois, and there's a tall green milkweed, which a lot of people didn't think monarchs used it because its cardenolide production's too high. It was considered too toxic. What I found out though is this particular remnant, that dark green milkweed, was full of monarch caterpillars, and they were late stage caterpillars, so they had been feeding on these milkweeds for a while. And what I noticed, again, behaviorally, you gotta look at these behaviors. Behaviorally, they were going up and they would start chewing on the stem of the flowers, basically cutting off the flow to those flowers and those stalks, and then we're eating the flowers, that floral stem. And if you know anything about milkweeds, and you know anything about these chemicals that the plants generate to help protect themselves, is that they're expensive to make. A lot of times plants won't put those cardenolides into where the flowers are. They concentrate it more in the leaves. And so I'd love to see somebody do some research on this, but I actually think that those monarchs may have been using those plants. And yeah, it was a plant that was highly toxic, but it wasn't highly toxic throughout the whole plant. So the monarchs were specifically targeting the parts of the plant they could use. It's real complex. There's a lot of stuff going on out there. It's another pop quiz. Beautiful white flowers. See, it's got little spikes of them with those whorled leaves. Do you remember what that one is? Culver's root. And here, it's going to be kind of hard to see this stem here. It's a green stem, and it has what are called nodes, or segments. And you can see there are black rings at each segment. And then up at the top, that's its flower. That's its fruiting body. These are scouring rushes. They're related to ferns. They produce spores. They don't produce seed like the flowering plants, like most of the plants we've been looking at here. That's the one, if you watched any of my previous videos, I mentioned it's called scouring rush because there's a lot of silica in that stem. That's what's making it stand upright. It's very rigid, and the Native Americans and then the early settlers would take that, they would ball it up, and they would use it almost like a scouring pad to clean dishes, pots, pans, whatever you needed to clean. Here's a great stand. This is one of my favorite plants. Great stand of that culver's root. Look at that. Beautiful. I've been looking for this. I thought we were a little too early, and I think we are, but not too early to find this plant in bloom. So you see, it's over the hill again. It's on this wetter side of things, but here we have an ironweed. So look at these leaves. So with the ironweed, make sure you take a look at the stems, the top of the leaf, the bottom of the leaf, the top of the leaf. Oh, I got a bumblebee. He's gonna hang out here for the night. Sorry, guy. I didn't know that was your bed. Look at the bottom of the leaf. Look at the flowers. And most importantly, look at the back of the flower. So right here, behind that flower, kind of looks, sorry guys, let me get the camera back. It looks like there are scales. These are all flat. They're not sticking out or pokey or anything like that. Look at those scales. Those are bracts that you can use to help identify this ironweed versus another ironweed. Over here, there's a dense stand of switchgrass. Now, in early days of restoration, switchgrass was used for everything. The problem is we started using them as quote-unquote improved varieties, which means we gave them Superman powers. And what's happening is when you use these quote-unquote improved varieties, their Superman powers push all the other plants out of the way. And then you get this real dense stand of just that cultivar. It's not good. That's not our intent. It wasn't the intent of the individuals who first started out with this. It's just we've learned so much since those days. So at all costs, stay away from the switchgrass stands. You can include switchgrass where it's appropriate, but make sure that it is an ecotype, a native ecotype, a natural selection. So it hasn't been improved. It just means you're getting a plant from the geographic area where you're going to be doing your planting. You want to match those up. You don't want an improved variety. You want an ecotype, natural selection from your geographic area. Now I don't see flowers yet, but these are the leaves of the prairie dock. And again, they're big, they're robust, very rough on both sides. They feel just like the compass plant. They feel just like the rosinweed. That's because they're all silphiums. They're all in that same genus. We do have down here, we have a wild grape. It looks like just the fox grape. So this is the not rosinweed, I apologize. This is the ironweed again. Like I said, I'm gonna have to look that one up. It's getting dark. Yeah, well, that looks like it for this video, guys. Thank you very much for joining me. Again, this is Jennifer, Midwest Wilderness Connections, checking out a railroad right-of-way in Champaign County that is full of prairie remnant plants that has stood the test of time so far. Bye, guys.